Okay. Welcome everyone to our PoSoCoMeS seminar, Post-Socialist Comparative Memory Study Seminar. And today we are discussing Katie Stewart's book, new book, Legitimating Nationalism, Political Identity in Russia's Ethnic Republics, which was published by University of Wisconsin Press in 2024. Professor Stewart is here with us. Thank you for coming. There are a couple of discussants, myself including. So I'm going to introduce our seminar participants, and then we'll give the floor to Dr. Stewart to give us kind of a summary of her book and maybe kind of how it came about. And then we'll proceed with remarks by the discussants and questions, and we'll finally open up for general discussion if that works. So usually the framework we're given is an hour and 30 minutes, but depending on how robust the conversation is, we can stay a little bit longer, so there's no pressure, unless of course you have to run to your next appointment. So welcome everyone. Katie Stewart is an associate professor of political science and international relations at Knox College, USA. Her research and teaching areas include nationalism, symbolic politics, authoritarianism, democratization, and research methods, with a regional focus on Russia and Eastern Europe. The book we're discussing today is Legitimating Nationalism, Political Identity in Russia's Ethnic Republics. She also published with Europe-Asia Studies, Nationalities Papers, and Polonar's Eurasia, and contributed to the edited volume Varieties of Russian Activism, State Society Contestation and Everyday Life, published by Indiana University Press in 2023. Most recently, I met for the first time in person. Professor Stewart was at the Association for the Study of Nationalities conference in New York City at Columbia University. So I had the pleasure of meeting her there. And I also found out that she was one of the people on the organizing committee of that important conference for this area of scholarship. So welcome, Professor Stewart. Our discussant, Guzel Yusupova, is a sociologist of identity politics on post-Soviet Eurasia. She's currently a Humboldt Fellow at Osteuropa Institute Freie Universität Berlin. Before coming to Germany, Guzel has held academic appointments in the UK, Canada, Sweden, and the Russian Federation. Her research appeared in academic journals such as Post-Soviet Affairs, Europe-Asia Studies, Ethnicities, Nations and Nationalism, and others. And finally, yours truly, I'm a professor of rhetoric and visual studies at Pennsylvania State University. My research and teaching encompass rhetorical theory and history, public memory, and visual culture. I investigate the rhetoric and politics of public memory in Russia and post-Soviet countries. And my most recent book, also published in 2024, is Remembering the War, Forgetting the Terror, Appeals to Family Memory in Putin's Russia, which was discussed earlier this year at this forum, at this seminar. So we're turning the floor over to Katie Stewart, and she will talk about her book and how it came about. Welcome,
Great.
Katie.
Thank you, Katya. Thanks. I'd like to start by thanking PoSoCoMeS and for hosting this book discussion, and especially Katya and Guzel for reading the book and agreeing to engage with it here today. So I'll start by going over the purpose of the book, the theory and methods that I use throughout it, and a bit about the main findings that I have at the end. So I start the book by comparing two celebrations that I observed in Petrozavodsk, the capital of the Republic of Karelia, which is one of Russia's ethnic republics near the border with Finland. Right? So those events were the 2015 National Unity Day celebration and the 2016 second anniversary of the annexation of Crimea. So these events were interesting in part because they have the exact same format to them. They were held at the same location as the Children and Youth Creativity Palace. They had the same format, the sort of a meeting concert. So you have speakers and you have musicians. and kind of the same crowd atmosphere as well. You have some people coming with flags for political parties, others standing around with various posters, and some just observing. Uh, but the other interesting thing then is the slight differences in the messaging of the two events, right? And different conceptions of what the Russian nation is through the messages portrayed here. So whereas the annexation of Crimea celebration was focused more on a ethnic Russian conception of what the nation is, saying that we need to reunite our co-ethnic Russians from abroad, the National Unity Day celebration left more space for a multinational version of the Russian nation, emphasizing that Russia does gain strength through its multinational people, with the caveat that so long as there is unity among those peoples. And in that National Unity Day celebration, there are elements nodding to that multi-ethnic nature. For instance, ending with a Karelian circle dance for the event. So what these two events show is that there is some flexibility in this broader Russian national narrative, which can be useful when applied in certain ways. We often think of nation building as being this monolithic nationwide process because that's how it's talked about by the people implementing nation building, right? You don't want to talk about slight variations across the country, but that's how we all experience nation building. It's more at that local level. In an autocratic federation like Russia, there is still some delegation of policy implementation, including in nation building policies, be it local politicians or local cultural centers or museums deciding what presentations to put forward. So that's the main focus of this book. I want to understand what that variation in Russian nation building looks like and how it impacts the durability of Putin's regime. So I put forward a theory of legitimating nationalism, where I propose that exposure to different nation building tactics like holiday celebrations or going to a museum can impact your feelings of belonging and pride, either in the Russian nation or in different regional identities as well, and how those feelings then translate into political behavior, like voting for United Russia. And when legitimating nationalism is working well for the regime, then in the case of Russia, that means that Putin and United Russia are being connected to the Russian nation as the authentic speakers for it and as the sort of one and only protector and promoter of the nation. And often this is sort of comes across as Putin as being sort of a father figure for the nation. Right? So when it's working well, going to that National Unity Day celebration is going to increase Russian pride and belonging. You're going to see sort of Putin give speeches on the day. You're going to connect the two together. You're going to see Putin as the uniter of those peoples within Russia. And then come election time, you might then vote for Putin and United Russia. But there are potential cracks in this process, some different weak points. So it might be that the particular tactic doesn't resonate with the people experiencing it or witnessing the celebration or museum exhibit, right? So it wouldn't then spark that emotional response afterwards. It could also break down if there's not that connection between the emotional response and Putin. So if he's not coming across as that effective speaker for the nation, then it won't translate into the political behavior. It can also break down if there are competitive identity works in the process, where it's not just trying to create a Russian nation, but more strength for regional identities that might compete with that Russian national identity. So in the book, I want to understand to what extent is legitimate nationalism working? So how does Russian nation building translate into support or not for Putin's regime? And then also, what does that variation look like across Russia's regions? So I use multi-method approach to tackle these questions. For the question of is it actually working, I conducted a survey in 6 regions of Russia, 3 ethnic republics, and 3 neighboring non-ethnic regions. And for examining the variation, I conducted fieldwork in Russia in 2014, and then the 2015-2016 academic year, engaging in participant observation, conducting interviews, going to the museums, and the like. Right? So I'll just give a brief overview of some of the findings, because I want to get to the discussion part here. So in terms of the first question, is legitimating nationalism working? I find that it does work overall, but with caveats, as you might expect. So I find that feelings of belonging to the Russian nation and pride are actually linked to more positive evaluations of the regime and likely voting behavior for United Russia. But there is some variation in, say, the impact of different tactics. For instance, exposure to holidays and speeches of Putin are really effective tactics at stimulating those emotions of belonging and pride. But going to a museum, for instance, can sometimes actually have a counter effect where you feel less connected to the Russian nation. And the sort of extent of how this impact plays out across different ethnicities can vary. So you have not just differences across the tactics, but differences in their impacts on different populations within Russia. So while there is some alternative sources of identity connection, so there's regional belonging and pride that I found as well, at this point, it's not decreasing support for the Putin regime necessarily, right? So you can have complementary bases of connection to the Russian nation and to a regional identity. But that does point to a potential crack in that legitimating nationalism system, where if those identities become more competitive, then there could be that decrease in support. So in terms of the second question, what does Russian nation building look like in the different regions? I examined 4 different nation building tactics. I look at monuments in the capital cities of each of the 3 republics, Karelia, Tatarstan, and Buryatia, that I look at to see what is the source of variation, but also similarities across the 3 republics. I examine holidays that are celebrated in the republics and compare them to the national Moscow celebrations. I examine the contents of museums in the 3 capital cities. And lastly, the narratives presented in regional history textbooks, focusing on those points of integration into the Russian state, right? So how is the incorporation into the Russian Empire presented? What about the Soviet Union? How about contemporary Russia today, right? So across all those different tactics, I'm always comparing across the 3 republics to see to what extent is there uniformity in that national narrative coming across, or is there accommodation of regional particularities into the narrative? And to the extent that there is accommodation, is that complementary to the central Russian nation building narrative, or is it adding competitive elements that are sort of not compatible with the narratives coming from the Putin regime? And so overall, I find some variation across the 3 republics. In Karelia, I do find sort of more assimilation, but also some accommodation in the identity building process. So there is some distinctiveness of the creation of a sort of distinctive northern identity and some elements of Finnish culture brought in through the different nation building tactics. But often it's mostly a complementary type of accommodation. So this regionalization of remembrance and identity, right, is not sort of challenging that central narrative in any important sort of way. In Buryatia, I also find a mix of assimilation and accommodation, though with some more competitive aspects of that regional identity building, bringing in more promotion of Buddhism and shamanism through museum presentations, through holiday celebrations. And Buryatia's textbook does incorporate some discussion of the violence of joining with Russia. lastly, in Tatarstan, I find that there is, as of the time of writing, it's gone down since then, but accommodation and even inclusion into the central national narrative. So you see in Moscow monuments to Tatar cultural figures. You see the thousand-year uh, memento from Kazan in a museum in Moscow, so showing that connection. Um, but at the same time, it's a bit competitive where there's say different narratives in the holidays. So unity not for the sake of strength and defense, but actually sort of unity as being able to promote diversity at the same time. So you have slightly different elements of the narrative there. So overall, I find that legitimate nationalism has been a source of support for the Putin regime that's been working well through its accommodation of some regional particularities. It makes that narrative resonate more with the local population. Uh, but at the same time, right, having that basis for regional identities does provide alternative ways of thinking about the political community and sort of to extent, is Putin actually the protector and the promoter for all Russians within the country? So I think I'll leave it there for now because I want to get it over to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Katie. This was really enlightening, and I will start by offering my congratulations on this really amazing, remarkable book. I think that it is quite an achievement and a remarkable work of scholarship on many levels. It is the first monograph that examines the role of ethnic republics within the Russian Federation in propagating, legitimizing nationalism, which is, a host of official practices that seek to create a broad support for Putin's regime's version of Russian identity and Russian history. And so the book analyzes both the discourses directed at national audiences and those that are deployed in three ethnic republics that have technically autonomous status within the Russian Federation. You study political speeches, monuments, holidays, secondary school history textbooks within Tatarstan, Buryatia, and Karelia. And in this way, the book really decenters Moscow as the only source of symbolic persuasion and propagation of this kind of nationalist narrative. And so in this way, it is very significant contribution because the majority of studies of Russian nationalism tend to be Kremlin-centric and Russian-centric, which leaves out vast swaths of the country. Another achievement of this book is the blend of theoretical sophistication and methodological diversity. And Dr. Stewart just kind of outlined her research design and how she went about carrying it out. So you work with theories of nationalism and identity to craft a compelling rationale for the study, designing and implementing surveys in Russia to test these hypotheses about the way people of Russian and non-Russian ethnicity react to appeals to dominant versions of national regional identity. And to supplement this data, you conducted ethnographic research in three republics using a combination of several tools: participant observation, qualitative interviews, visits, observations of museums, and of course, there's like vast archival work and analysis of media discourses that accompany these in situ fieldwork types of studies. So the fieldwork is truly impressive given the multiple sites that are examined in this book. And last but not least, I must really commend Dr. Stewart for her sheer courage and stamina in carrying out this investigation. Not only did she learn Russian, which in itself is a daunting task for a native Anglophone, she conducted her field work as a young foreign woman in Putin's Russia, where misogyny and machismo are de facto social values, which means that she had to contend with suspicion toward foreigners and everyday sexism. That takes serious guts. So kudos to Dr. Stewart. And I'm also glad that Dr. Stewart managed to do her field work when she did, because as we know, it is really no longer safe or feasible after 2022 for Western scholars to venture into Russian Federation to do any kind of work. So her detailed field observations and analysis are even more valuable. I do have a couple of questions about the design and interpretation of the study. My first question is a global one about sort of the general reliability of any kind of sociological surveys in contemporary Russia. I wonder if you can elaborate on the constraints of this sort of work there. You mentioned that you conducted your surveys with the help of the Levada Center, which is the only non-governmental organization that performs sociological surveys and was declared a foreign agent by the Russian Ministry of Justice as well. In preparing for the seminar, I reread the 2018 interview with the Levada Center director, Lev Gutkov, in which he lamented how the government-controlled survey industry has corrupted the field. Gutkov believes that the majority of people who respond to surveys in Russia may not have any love for Putin, but they nonetheless vote for United Russia because they see no alternative. Another claim that he makes is that the regime's power rests not on ardent enthusiasm or identification with the nationalism, but on passivity. And so this is kind of like the baseline assumption of a lot of sociologists, independent sociologists, that people in Russia are not, eager beavers who want national narratives, but they're like the majority actually more passive and even cynical, but they don't see any alternative to the regime. And my second question is about museums, and it kind of goes with the first question. So I wonder if the museum, as a side of national narrative construction and national identity construction, is a bit of a different animal from other forums where national identity and pride are being proclaimed. So when you go to a museum, you don't really see as clearly kind of the agent or the political authority that is behind it, and unless there's like an opening museum that is attended by politicians and there's some kind of festivity around it. So it seems to me that going to a museum opens up a space for people to actually feel the way they actually do about the regime and the stories it propagates. So they would be more willing to assert that they're not interested, or they feel less proud or less enthusiastic about the narrative, because the context does not require them to express their conformity. So these are my two global questions, and I hope we can have more discussion about the method and the kind of specific sites of this discourse.
Great. Thank you so much for the questions. I'll start with the survey one. Right? This is always difficult to do, especially in authoritarian contexts. I'd say the main constraint of the survey was my response rate was lower than I wanted it to be. So there is potential there for, well, are people only answering who are comfortable answering these questions? But I find in the data, there is sort of a somewhat broad mixture of responses. They don't seem like heavily skewed in one direction or the other. So while I'm concerned about the low response rate, I think there is still variation in who I got to respond to the survey. And in terms of designing the questions to make it more likely that they might respond actually how they feel, I tried to ask them the main questions in a couple of different ways, and to not mention Putin at all in the survey itself. So for instance, in trying to measure uh, like legitimacy of the regime, which is uh, really a difficult concept to actually measure, and people have done it in different ways. I've taken it in a couple different directions. So, two questions that look at this were uh, one question on just asking the direction of the country, and they could answer, is country going in a positive direction or a negative direction? Another way to do that was looking at a question about effective management of the country, right? So not naming Putin, not naming United Russia, but on a scale of 1 to 10, how effective would you say the management of the country is? So by having the two different questions in there, I could check the responses against each other in that way to see, all right, are there certain groups of people who are just afraid to answer any direction? So they would say like hard to say for the direction of the country, and then fall in the middle on the effective management scale. Um, Another way of getting at this then was the question about voting behavior. So I asked, if elections were held next Sunday, would you vote? And if yes, for which party? And there I did actually get quite a spread across the political parties, United Russia coming in first in each of the regions. But if I remember correctly, about, I don't think any of them were over 50% uh, for United Russia, if I remember correctly. Um, so people were okay with saying that they were going to vote for another party, or that they weren't going to vote at all. So yeah, well, I think one of the main issues was the response rate. I think the nature of having this be on the telephone, um, and by the Levada Center, which at the time was seen as it didn't yet have the foreign label agent. This was just before then. Um, Hopefully, sort of adds to the reliability of that data. For the museums, that's sort of an interesting thought of maybe that's more like a neutral space where you don't have the politics hanging over at all times as you go in. Um, so potentially that's part of why people are feel more open to saying um, sort of what they feel about it, because the museum's not, unless you study museums, you don't necessarily think about it as an inherently political space. But in some of them, it actually was in terms of the exhibits. So, for example, at the end of the Museum of Statehood for Tatarstan, you have a room with pictures of Shaimiev and Minnikhanov kind of through the years meeting with different global leaders. So in that case, kind of the politicians were front and center as you're exiting the museum. So it's connecting that sort of century of statehood to Tatarstan's current political leaders. Um, but that it does vary museum to museum, sort of to what extent the politics is very present in terms of the contemporary leaders. Um, in Moscow, the oh, I'm blanking on the name, Contemporary History Museum of Russia, politicians were all over that one as well. So in that case, right, there's sort of a very clear connection to how this history relates to politics today. In say an art museum, be very much less so, right? So um, there it would be sort of focusing on the cultural figures that sometimes have a political narrative to accompany them, but not always. Yeah, so something to think more about is so comparing the nature of the different tactics across each other. Uh, and I think a good approach to that would be perhaps placing them on a spectrum of uh, sort of tightness of control from above and how they're developed and how they're displayed versus openness for interpretation as people are moving through the space or interacting with the particular tactic. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems like there's such a variation in the museum scene, right? And yeah, it would be kind of interesting to drill down into the specifics and also like what kind of occasions bring people to the museum. I think you mentioned that on a few occasions you were the only person there, so it's hard to judge how actual people respond. uh, did they have like visitor blogs where people could write down any responses to the museums? Did you encounter any of that?
Yeah, so some did. I did not collect that data as I was going through. Um, One of the more interesting ones of that was actually a Moscow museum, the Gulag Museum, asking people at the end to think through uh, how they would want this to never happen again today, and like write down on sticky notes. So you occasionally see some of that interaction where your visitors are prompted to ask certain questions of their experience in the museum to sort of guide how it impacts them as they leave the door and go back to their lives. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and of course the Gulag Museum is a very different kind of museum from the ones that promote Russian pride, and it's more of a critical space that maybe made it more dangerous recently. So it was actually closed um, last year or
Mm.
even earlier. So
It was
yeah,
interesting, even when I was there though, and I think that was in 2015. One of the museum workers wanted to emphasize to me, like, oh, this is explaining the political prisoners that we had back then during the Soviet times, but we don't have political prisoners today. So there's a bit of conflicting messages coming through.
yeah. There's definitely in sort of state-controlled sites of memory a disavowal that anything like that is going on now. So if you support a construction of a memorial to political victims of political terror in the Soviet time, um, you are thereby proclaiming that you're not engaged in doing something like that right now, right? Which is not true. Yeah, thanks so much. We will turn over to Guzel. Welcome.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Katya, for organizing this seminar and inviting me for discussing this book. And of course, thank you, Katie, so much for writing this book. It was very useful, very thought-provoking read for me. I had many insights, many further research questions, and I'm super grateful for you for very interesting results that you shared with us. But first of all, I have to also highlight your bravery for writing, choosing a PhD topic on such a topic as Russian regions. That at the time when you chose it, it was not so topical, not so interesting, perhaps, as criminology and Putin-centered research on Russia or protest-centered research on Russia, and see how it is important your book now when, unfortunately, with the full invasion of Ukraine by Russia, suddenly the focus of researchers turned to the regional, to the national level, and also ordinary people who suddenly became important actors in politics. So this was brave to choose this topic. Because it was not so well advertised, let's say, or not so prestigious perhaps as other topics. I'm also grateful that you're focusing on banal nationalism, on ordinary people in this book. And you show very well how it is important as well. This seemingly unimportant monuments, textbooks, etc. How they sorry, I have this something. Yeah, come up on my screen. Sorry, how it is important. So I see my task is to tell everyone why should you read this book. And first, I think it's a major contribution to the Russian studies. In general, as I told that it's focusing on regions and importantly, yes, as you mentioned in your book, that there are some research on particular regions in Russia, on some ethnic regions in Russia, but your research proposes comparative analysis of several regions, Russian regions. And most importantly, I would like to thank you and highlight again that you also include non-ethnic regions in your research. Actually, you focus on Samara region and the Murmansk region and some other regions. And it's important to take them into account too, because they also have their own specific dynamics of this resistance or accommodation of this top-down nationalizing politics. And you also show it and include it in your analysis, and this is very valuable, I think. Comparative, and this book is of course in 1990s there were lots of very important books by Dmitry Gorenburg, Olis Giuliano, Kate Graney, focusing on Russian federalism and how regions are important, but not so much after Vladimir Putin came to power. And this comparative perspective, it's such is very, very important, because you also develop very theoretical framework how to tackle this question of legitimizing nationalism, how it could be actually done, how can we taste or touch reality on the local level, how people actually do engage in top-down, Kremlin top-down politics, and how regional elite maybe reinforce it or resist to it or redesign it or co-create it, let's say. Why else should everyone read this book? Is because it's also a contribution to the studies of authoritarianism in general and authoritarian regime legitimization, since as far as I know, most of this research focuses on conservative ideologies that are very important for regime legitimization and authoritarian, for authoritarian consolidation. But you focus on seemingly democratic, actually, ideology, that nation as a something, as a phenomenon that should unite equally all people, all citizens of this particular country. But you look at it as you have this interesting insight, intuition. How can one look at it as a legitimizing tool for authoritarian consolidation, actually? And this is, as such, the very research question that you are posing is very creative in my view. And importantly also for this literature on authoritarianism, you show how this legitimization can be both resisted and co-constructed by regional authorities. And you show that it can be done, it's always two-way road, let's say, for authorities and also for people and different practices. And here I come to the third major contribution to the third field of research on banal nationalism and nationalism studies in general. You focused on the importance of banal nationalism, on seemingly unimportant monuments, textbooks, holiday celebrations, and you managed to show their importance, in my view. And because all my own research overlaps with all this ethnic nationalism studies and authoritarianism studies and Russia studies, I'm really grateful that you did show this importance. And the main insight that I get from this focus on a banal part of still top-down nationalizing policy. It's banal, but it's not bottom-up. It's still top-down. Elites, regional elites write these textbooks. Regional elites choose whom to praise, to establish a monument, etc. My main insight was that if you read carefully, you can see that some successful nationalizing policies in 1990s are still alive, because these textbooks, as you notice in your writing, were initially written during 1990s or early 2000s, and they are just re-edited or they are still the same. These monuments were established in late 1990s or early 2000s, and these observations show us that 1990s legacy are actually still alive, and they still impact the perception of the regional identity and national identity, and they are they present some or opportunities for opposition to this Kremlin top-down nationalizing policies that also ethnicized, and this ethnicized. I'm also very happy that, maybe not happy, but I acknowledge that it's important to see that ethnicized nationalism policies that pick up by regional elites, but your book shows that it is actually ethnicized not from bottom up as we usually perceive, that ethnic, like understanding yourself in ethnic terms, it comes from uneducated people, and this top-down, highlighting this top-down nature of this ethnicizing nationalism, both on regional level and on a more national level, is also important. And I think this combination, the main strength of this book is that specifically this combination of top-down view and bottom-up perspective, how elites implement this nationalizing policies, both central Moscow elites, regional, and how people actually perceive it. It's very rarely done. So this very complex book that actually tackles upon very complex topic, diversity in Russia, and how nationalizing politics perceived by various groups and on various levels. It was hard to do, but you come up with complex theory, and this book also could be used in my view in political sociology syllabuses or nationalism studies syllabuses, because it presents very interesting theoretical framework. But I have few questions for you, and still something was not so much clear for me, nevertheless, because again the topic is very complex, I think. First, sometimes I didn't quite really well understood is a regional versus national identity work is a zero-sum game or not. Like sometimes you highlight that nationalizing policies contradict with the regional ones. Sometimes they actually reinforce them. So could you please elaborate on it more? Is it a zero-sum game? Is it a complementary? When and why? And the second question is about your main argument that this it's also a little bit like it is convincing your main argument, but still there are also some counter-arguments to what you're saying, that those who feel pride in nation support regime. It's one of your arguments, as I understood this. So Could it be that it's the other way around, that those people who work in, who are more exposed for these nationalizing practices that you describe, like participation in a nationality, a celebration of Unity Day, exposure for museum exhibitions, they are mostly state workers who tend to support government because they are more dependent on it. So is it could it be the other way around, those who support the regime are more nationalistic, let's say, or I can frame it differently. Can a person strongly identify with the nation state but do not strongly support regime? Can it be, and why it is important or not important? And the third question would be legitimizing nationalism as legitimizing nation building strategy. How is it different from the likes in democracies? I think you show this, how it works in authoritarian regime, but can your theory also be applicable to democracies? That democracies legitimize liberal democratic regimes by appealing to nation building as we all belong to the same nation on equal terms, and this is what unites us, and it's important, and this is why we rule. And a couple of more questions. Do you think less affiliation with the state might result in decrease of regime legitimacy? Current Russia's full invasion of Ukraine, for some part of population, not for all, but for some part, resulted in a less affiliation with the state. Many ethnic minorities suddenly remembered that they have stronger now ethnic identification that the state. Some argue, at least some researchers argue, that people became disappointed and less proud in a Russian state. Could it result in decrease of regime legitimacy or not? Maybe it's a silly question, you can leave it. I wanted to read actually, okay, at the end, I wanted to read a gem that you have found that would be interesting for everybody, and in my view, and that would instigate the interest in the book. But my last question, another important insight for me was that this juxtaposition of celebration of unity versus diversity. You mentioned that in most of the speeches, elites highlight the unity of the Russian different nations that constitute Russian Federation, and only in Tatarstan they highlight actually diversity. More than unity, they highlight unity. Did you notice some other instances of this juxtaposition? Could you give some more example how actually why are these two? They can be complementary, but still they are Putin versus diversity versus unity. And finally, if you have time, just a little bit, I think it's brilliant. Brilliant picture how this legitimizing nationalism works, both in reinforcing overall national pride and confronting or questioning it. It's a quote from Buratian historical book on Buryatia. It's 188 in your book. You say, the text states, summing up the analysis of this period of acquisition of Buryat territories by the Russian Empire. So, summing up the analysis of this period, it should be noted that, despite the fact that accession of Buryatia to the Russian state was a forced violent nature, which later led to increased national oppression, Russification of the Buryats, and the destruction of the system of national traditions and customs. In all, it had historical meaning both for Russia and for indigenous Buryat people. Being in composition of the new state, the Buryat people were engaged in peaceful labor in more favorable conditions than before, growing numerically, developing economically, socially, spiritually, and culturally. But furthermore, it states that Buryatia became the most important outpost in the east of the country, as well as the source of the empire's financial well-being, which was primarily from fur, silver, gold, and other riches of its subsoil. I think it's very telling example why we should still focus on subnational levels and make a comparative analysis of how contemporary Putin's Russia tries to legitimize its regime. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Guzel. I'll try to get through the questions in order here. So the first one was about is regional versus national identity a zero-sum game? And I would argue no, that they can be complementary sorts of identities. It would become zero-sum if the narratives and values associated with those identities are in direct conflict, where they can't coexist naturally with one another. So, for example, one person I interviewed in Karelia described Karelia as being kind of like more Western, more liberal in orientation because of its position on the border with Finland, being closer to the West. So if a stronger sort of Karelian identity was based around that type of emphasis, then it would be more of that zero-sum game, because the central national narrative is very much the West is the threat. We need to be a conservative stronghold. So, right, as long as they're fitting within one another, where, yes, we're recognizing, say, local heroes from the Great Patriotic War with busts and inscriptions in the local language, that's bringing a regional sort of flair to the remembrance, but it's still within the same national narrative. So that wouldn't be a zero-sum type of game. That would be together in a productive way, especially from the view of the center. So next question, right, about sort of could it be that sort of maybe more state employees are going to some of these events or museums, so they're already sort of predisposed to have high levels of pride or belonging. And I think that's accurate. So there are some endogeneity issues in the model, right, where it can be that some of the people, say, going to National Unity Day celebrations already feel that sort of pride, so that's why they're going. But I would argue even for those people, there's still that reinforcement mechanism through the process of going to the celebration, where they are sort of rehearing some of the narratives. They're seeing those around them also going to the celebration and celebrating in the same way. So it's both reinforcing, but then also by their presence, right, showing those who are not necessarily predisposed that, okay, this is the way to celebrate. This is how to join in the community if I want to. So I think though there can be a time where someone identifies strongly with Russian state symbols and history, but still be against Putin. I think that would be an example of legitimated nationalism failing. Right? That would be an example where Putin is not effectively tying himself to this narrative of being the one and only protector and promoter of the Russian nation. Because part of that is closing off alternatives for who would be able to lead the nation forward and support its sort of thriving and existence in different ways. So that would be a breakdown in between that exposure and then sort of connections to political activity, right? So if, for instance, someone else is able to avoid and provide an alternative, there could then be, right, another way to utilize legitimate nationalism for another purpose. Yeah, so then the question of, we're seeing less affiliation with the state during Russia's war against Ukraine. Could that possibly lead to less legitimacy for the regime? And I would argue, right, yes, that is one of the potential effects of this war, and something that, in fact, we're seeing. In fact, there's an article by Maria Snegovaya who found that those who have higher levels of Russian pride are also more supportive of the war, right? So we can see the counter effect, right, potentially taking place, right? You have less pride, less support for the war, and then potentially less support for the regime itself, right? And that's why I'm not arguing legitimate nationalism is the sole pillar holding up the Putin regime. That's why we're seeing turns to the other pillars of support, like repression, in that case. I think it's the last one. So thinking through, right, this juxtaposition of narratives of Russian unity for the sake of defense versus unity highlighting the diversity of Russia's multinational people, right? So we can also think of it as sort of unity for the sake of strength and defense versus unity for the strength of upholding diversity. And I think the other example where that plays out is actually in the Buryatia textbook that you were quoting from at the end there. So there's, in other parts, sort of discussion of Buryatia sort of playing a key role in making sure that contemporary Russian federalism, yes, held the state together. So there's that part of promoting territorial integrity and unity, but also making sure that there was autonomy for Russia's indigenous people in the process. So fighting back against sort of defederalization of the country, right? So you do see some of that in Buryatia of trying to uphold some value in diversity itself, not just let's shift immediately from diversity to unity, where anyone who doesn't unify is seen then as the opposition and as an enemy of the people. So I think that was all of them. Did I miss anything?
Thank you. I would like to hear more questions. So
at this point, thank you, Guzel and Katie. I think we can open up for questions, and I see one question in the chat already about the title of the book. How correct is to call non-ethnically Russians Russia's ethnic republics? So I guess it's just a question of clarification.
Yeah, so I use the title ethnic republics because a large portion of the book was the qualitative research comparing Karelia, Tatarstan, and Buryatia, and in sort of a lot of the research on federalism in Russia and the Soviet Union before. That tends to be the term used to define those regions, as opposed to the oblasts and the krais that aren't sort of historically labeled as homelands for a titular ethnic group.
Yes, please, Marina. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for such an interesting event, and thank you for doing a tremendous job and writing this book and letting us all know what you think about it. I want to just a little bit kind of like talk more about the question, why I'm asking it, the way I'm asking it. I want to just everybody know that for centuries, Russia has cultivated and propagated the image of the mono-ethnic state. As we know that it's a big surprise for a lot of people. I'm living in America, asking me, where are you from? I'm saying, I'm from Russia. The next question, where are you exactly from? I'm from so-and-so. And then, so it's just like, it's not only me, all non-ethnically Russian are kind of like invisible people, because for centuries and for especially last century and in now also the Russia propagated as Russia is a mono-ethnic state, and us are kind of like becoming an invisible people. I am Buddha Mongol myself, and that's why I'm asking. It's my experience. I spent like 35 years of my life in Russia before I immigrated. And even in the Soviet Union, which ethnically was only half Russian, was frequently labeled simply as Russia in Western academia, as though it were not a homogeneous nation, ethnically speaking. This persistent erasure explains why I, Brett Mongol in the United States, am often met with disbelief when I state my origin. To many, my very existence contradict their perception of Russia as an exclusively ethnic Russian domain. Even those who claim to oppose the current authoritarian regime continues to envision a прекрасная Россия будущего. On that, in practice, would perpetuate the exploitation of colonized lands and the extraction of the resources, which is actually kind of like feeding the type of the feeding economy, as you know, Russia is. While it is unsurprising that loyalists, so-called хорошие русские, and this state uphold such narratives, it is far more troubling that scholars like you are, by definition, we are supposed to possess a critical understanding of this subject and this particular side of this problematic issue, who nevertheless reinforced by, I am thinking like keeping the title like this is kind of like reinforcing this imperial discourse. By doing so, it's like kind of like legitimizing the very structure of the oppression, the kind of like trying to analyze. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this question.
So I think part of the main reason to why the ethnic republics was in the title was in part to signal that this was a book looking beyond Moscow, beyond the Russocentric portrayals of Russia in a lot of research. But I do appreciate that point that it is sort of like, why don't we call, say, majority Russian regions, ethnic Russian regions, for instance? We don't see that happening as often. Thank you.
I know it's really hard to kind of go through like against the current, but at some point we stop doing it, because otherwise it's like we also have the problem even for other Slavic nations, right? That are like even the name of the departments in America, for instance, right? They are called like Russia Plus, while it's actually it's kind of like the very definition of us and our existence and whatever the political and you know, the social political part of the like, I don't know, social fabric you're trying to go through. You kind of like representing us as from Russia. You see what I mean? It's just like defining, like the very definition is around that, while there probably would be cut maybe for future to try to look like not to explain our very existence only from Russia, because our history is longer than that. Thank you.
We have another question in the chat. Can you summarize your main arguments regarding the comparisons of non-ethnic regions with ethnic republics? It is great you integrate both categories.
Great, yes. So I include both regions in the survey part of the chapter where I'm looking at how effective legitimate nationalism and some interesting variation both within sort of the republics and with the non-ethnic regions as well. So based on sort of prior research and theory, we might expect that all non-ethnic regions and republics or non-ethnic regions would act similarly and republics would act similarly. But that's not necessarily the case. I find there's not a neat connection between the type of institutions and the responses to nation building. Overall, there tends to be less of an impact of when I'm looking at individual nation building tactics at individual regions. There tends to be less of an impact in Murmansk, in Irkutsk, and in Samara than in the republics. But overall, I think it's important that the finding is we can't really generalize that all non-ethnic regions will behave one way and republics another. That a lot of the variation comes sort of within those units based on sort of individual characteristics like ethnicity or socioeconomic statistics.
Thank you. And we have a little bit more time for questions. We have about 20 minutes left if you have time to stay until 1 o'clock. So please. Feel free to write your question in the chat or you can pose it directly.
So I'll ask an obvious question that everyone has in mind, I guess. So by your opinion, will Russia disintegrate based on ethnic lines or not? How would you reply to this?
Yeah, so I would argue that breakup along republic lines, like Soviet Union style, isn't likely due to the sort of differences in available resources and geography that we have in Russia today versus the Soviet Union. But that doesn't mean I think that resistance to the war and to the regime won't have that sort of regional component to it. So just as we're seeing a regional dimension to how the war is being carried out, with soldiers being or disproportionately taken from the republics and especially the poor regions of Russia and dying disproportionately as well, I expect that sort of that process to sort of heighten Guzel, your question from earlier of are we going to see sort of less affiliation with the state and legitimacy for the regime as the war carries on. So I would argue we're already seeing that in the way that the war resistance has taken shape. But we also have to look at the political opportunity structure for such a breakup of Russia as well. So at this point, regional elites, they have a lot of incentives to keep sort of control, to keep their partnership with the Kremlin, because their benefits are directly tied to the status quo of keeping that going. So it's a combination of needing to look at the demand side for the dissolution and the resources that those demanding separation have at their disposal, but also that what does the opportunity look like? To what extent is the repressive apparatus still functioning? But then that's another question of what would it take for those regional elites to change their decision-making calculus of what's benefiting them going into the future. Is it still the status quo? But there's, right, like I mentioned, although that sort of structure is especially tightened now, for having or more competitive visions of sort of identity construction, that sort of base that they have been developed previously means that even though they're potentially repressed with the new regional textbooks coming out, for instance, that are going to be dictated from the center, there's still the memory discussion of, say, the previous versions where there hadn't been as tight of control, right? So there are some of those symbolic resources still at play.
Yeah, we have another question in the chat. Thank you, Katie. Lots of thoughts. You inspired lots of thoughts.
Yeah, so why I chose these specific republics for these surveys, I wanted to get variation on the percentage of titular ethnicities in the republics, and also sort of geographical region, plus a variation in sort of religious and cultural distance from the presentation of the sort of ethnic Russian. What is the stereotype of that? So with that variation, I hope to better understand how the changes in that context influences what strategies are employed in the different regions. So for instance, with the inclusion of Tatarstan, which sort of has a high percentage of Tatars in the Republic, but also across Russia as a whole, right? How does that shape the calculus to have more accommodation and even some inclusion of the Tatar regional identity versus, say, Karelia with a very small titular ethnicity, more economic dependence on the center as well, with less potential resources to push for a more competitive type of regional identity.
Yeah, thank you.
Question, is it?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's not a sort of open access online version of the book. Libraries can purchase an ebook version to sort of have more spread that way. So hopefully libraries have done that.
Yes, and this is precisely the forum where we invite people to reach out to their libraries and ask them to purchase this book so it can reach more people. Yeah, it's really unfortunate how, at least in the US, and I don't know, maybe in Europe as well, university presses are really holding on tight to their monopoly. And yeah, it's very pricey to get open access, and it requires a lot of money upfront. So yeah, and I know that our previous seminar, one of the previous seminars, the book was open access, but that came from a big European grant that allowed it to be open access. I think there are ways, like I know that my book was put by Google Books and it's available in two of the case studies, the introduction and conclusion. So like if you look on Google Books, you might get a fair chunk of it, perhaps, especially if it was published in 24. So I would encourage people to check it out. I don't know if you had a chance to survey the landscape, the internet landscape, to see what's out.
Yeah, I think there might be 50 pages available on Google Books, something like that. I'm not sure which 50, but
yeah.
Mhm.
So you have a few more questions.
So I have not read through that review yet, unfortunately, so I can't respond to that comment. Let's see. How do religious identities such as Islam in Tatarstan or Buddhism in Buryatia interact with regional nationalism in Russia's ethnic republics? Do they reinforce or complicate efforts to legitimize regional political identity within the broader framework of Russian state nationalism? So yeah, they ended up interacting with regional nationalism and sort of nation building coming from the center in interesting ways. So it's not they always either reinforce or they always compete with the nation building going on. So the Russian Orthodox Church is at this point a very large both actor and sort of content in that central Russian nation building effort. But sometimes it's partnering with other across the Russian Federation. For example, in Tatarstan, some of the religious leaders are very much supportive of both United Russia and the sort of fitting Tatarstan within that narrative of a strong united Russia, providing a sort of counterweight to the West. So in that way, right, it's sort of reinforcing and complementing the center's nation building work. But in other times, say to give an example from Buryatia, in the main regional history museum, there's a whole floor dedicated to the development of Buddhism in the region. And through that, it's also connecting Buryatia to, it's not really connecting it to Russia at all, but connecting it to the broader Buddhist space. Right? So in those cases, right, it's kind of shifting what is the primary, say, unit of identification, right? At that point, it's not sort of Russian, it's not within the Russian state, but instead it's sort of connecting a regional Buryat's identity to a more global type of identity as well that's existed for since before Buryats was sort of colonized into the Russian Empire. So the answer is yes and no.
We have a few minutes for more questions. I must say we've had a pretty robust attendance at the seminar.
Just could you please tell us about your journey? How do you perceive its importance to the current discussion of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Sorry for this, but for formulating it like this, asking kind of, could you please praise your book a little bit more? But this is actually what I want to do, just to gain also some kind of more arguments from a colleague to justify why my own work is important, you know, to discuss why our work is important, because you see, it's not obvious, I think.
Yeah, so I think the sort of narratives and symbols used to promote the war and build up support, or at least alienate opposition, is building off a lot of the narratives and symbols that were already in place. So they're not brand new, right? So for example, and I was able to quickly add this to the book before it went to press as an example, I think, if I remember correctly. There was an exhibit on ordinary Nazism, as it was called, in the Victory Museum in Moscow. That was sort of very much based off of, and Katya can talk a lot more about this, but the remembrance of the Great Patriotic War and sort of building that narrative and carrying it forward into the present. And then how it's tied into my research is looking at how Well, that exhibit then was shared with, I think it was about 30 other regional museums that took up the same narrative, some of the same type of exhibits, including in Ulan-Ude in Buryatia. So looking at the ways in which, right, the regional elites are working with the Kremlin to sort of disseminate the same narratives, but with their twist of connecting it now to the contemporary war in the Ukraine. So it's important that we're looking at to what extent are these extensions of the narrative working at the regional level or not.
Yeah, I was just looking at the numbers for the war casualties from Buryatia, and it's one of the leading regions, right, to contribute men to the war effort, and also like in pro-Russian, pro-government sources, you see like they're the most hero medals awarded. So there's this kind of sanctification or elevation of the war hero as a model citizen, right? That's happening throughout Russia, but especially in regions where you have the most casualties and where, you know, the proportion of ethnic Buryats have been conscripted is quite large. And so I know that, you know, those few opposition groups who are expressing criticism of that, you know, they point out that this is almost like a genocidal kind of politics, right, where you are wasting the lives of young Buryat men. So it's a very interesting how they're putting us in a kind of heroic spin on the sacrifices and so forth.
I saw that Marin has a question.
Thank you. I wonder, I have two questions. One is actually connected with just discussed, but I would like to ask them after this one. Did you took into account the factor of the foreign diasporas and their position towards the Russian nationalism? Of
No,
those
so I was
republics
focused
you
on.
were actually analyzing.
Mhm. No, I was focused on those who are still living in the republics. Mm-hmm.
So, and do you think it would kind of like doing that this way, you're saying that it's kind of like the diasporas and their activities are not really making any difference or shouldn't be taken into account to understand to what extent, in what way the ethnic group of this or that is actually what they're thinking and how they participate in Russian nationalism?
No, so I'm not saying it would have no impact. Part of it's a limitation of sort of research resources and time. So that would take another grant probably to be able to sort of research the diaspora. But I think for the purposes of testing the theory of the book, I'm not sure that the Putin regime is interested so much in sort of targeting the diaspora in terms of trying to bring them into this version of the Russian nation and sort of thinking of that as a target audience. So as I was testing how effective is sort of that at playing out at the regional level, that wasn't part of the research design.
Okay, and the second question is like, what do you think about that act of propaganda demonizing Buryats through this all happening because of the Russian-Ukrainian war? Also, like you understand that the Buryats is like 0.1%, and it's only like let's say we're talking about not the people who can be conscripted, the young relatively young men, it's less than that, right? Because in that 0.1, we're including the little kids and elderly people and women and so on and so forth. What do you think about the effort of demonizing the Burats as the, what is this? Is it like somehow connected that the Burats are definitely radically different from like even by the looks? And this is like kind of like to trying to shift the outrage of Ukrainian people from the Russian, ethnically Russian themselves, who are definitely the vast majority of the people who are killing Ukrainians now. Thank you.
Yeah, so I can't directly speak to motive, but I think given the current state of the Russian nation building narrative, that does focus increasingly more on ethnic Russianness as being the example of what is the ideal Russian. It does, from that perspective of maintaining that and keeping protests outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, because that's where I think the regime would fear protests the most, having it at the center of power, then I would say it's not surprising that there is the overconscription and higher levels of casualties of Buryats in the war.
Moreover, in my upcoming paper, I will give an explanation why, potentially why ethnic minorities are dying in greater proportions than ethnic Russians in this war in Ukraine, and explain it by rurality, that mostly population targeted to participate are mostly rural population, and it ethnic minority origin often overlaps with rural background, and it's also a result of the Russian conquest and Russian language being a language of social mobility. Most of throughout the history of the Russian Empire and Soviet Union too. Sorry for advertising my research, but I think it is important and related to the question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for these questions and for the discussion. I think this is a robust seminar, and I think that obviously the current geopolitical moment is something that builds upon the years that are captured in this monograph, and so I think it is providing us with an interesting insight into this sort of nationalist consolidation, right? That the results of which we're seeing now, and yeah, and I'm sure that there's more to come, more plenty of material to write about, even though regrettably we may not be able to travel to Russia to do this kind of detailed field work as Dr. Stewart has performed for us. So thank you so much for coming. This has been a delightful discussion, and please come back. Our next seminar will be in a couple weeks. And
how to subscribe to your mailing list? I'm not in the mailing list.
Okay. Yes. If you, I don't know, maybe Daria can speak to that. It's a post-socialist comparative study memory group that is part of the Memory Studies Association. I don't know if you can subscribe to it without being a member, but I suspect there's a way to do it. So maybe, I don't know if Daria can chime in here, or Alina.
So here, I think there is a possibility, but I'm not sure how it works. Maybe Daria, do you know more about it?
I just put the email in the chat. 1 second. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming, for participating, and thank you, Katie Stewart. Thank you, Guzel. And thank you for all of your thoughts and contributions and future engagements. So have a great week. Have a great summer.